The river was rising. Gideon Yates stood at the edge of the Cimarron crossing on a Thursday afternoon in late April of 1878, watching the brown water churn and spit against the rocks below, and he already knew that the coach driver was going to try to push through anyway. Men like Horace Drummond always did. They had schedules to keep, and schedules meant more to them than lives. Gideon had seen it before. He had seen the aftermath too, the splintered wood and bloated animals, and the terrible silence that followed when the water won. What he had not seen before was the woman now standing on the bank with her traveling bag clutched to her chest, staring at the crossing like she was memorizing it, like she was trying to understand something the river was trying to tell her. She was not screaming. She was not weeping. She was not demanding to be taken across or insisting they turn back. She was simply watching, with brown eyes that caught the light off the water and held it in a way that made Gideon's chest do something embarrassing. He had no business noticing her eyes. He had business at the crossing. He worked the crossing. He hauled coaches through when the water climbed, when the horses panicked, when the current caught the wheels and tried to drag everything downstream. He had been doing it for 3 years, since he came back from a stretch of bad decisions and worse company, and settled into the one thing he was genuinely suited for, which was being large enough and stubborn enough to hold a 6-horse team steady in a rushing river, while other men yelled useless instructions from the bank. But he was staring at the woman, and she was staring at the river, and then the coach driver shouted something about making time before the storm broke overhead, and everything happened at once. The lead horse went in first, then the second pair. Then the back wheels dropped off the bank and the whole rig lurched sideways, and the passengers inside the coach began to scream, all of them except the woman with the brown eyes who grabbed the door frame and braced herself with a calm that was either courage or shock, and Gideon was already moving before he'd made any conscious decision to move. He went into the water up to his chest. The current hit him like a wall and he pushed back against it, his boots finding the river bottom through pure force of will, and he got his shoulder under the rear axle of the coach and his hands around the wheel spokes and he heaved. He heard something in his back protest. He ignored it. The driver was shouting. The horses were screaming their high, terrible horse screams. The water was cold enough to make thought difficult, cold enough to turn his hands clumsy, but he held on and he pushed and he walked forward one grinding step at a time until the wheels found traction on the gravel bar on the far bank, and the coach lurched up and out of the current like a thing being born. The passengers poured out. 3 men in business coats, a family with small children, a woman in green silk who immediately began to wail about her hat. They streamed past Gideon without acknowledgement while he stood in the shallows, water running off him in sheets, his back on fire, his hands shaking from the cold and the effort. And then she was there, the woman with the brown eyes. She was soaked to the knee and her hair had come half loose from its pins, and she looked at him the way people almost never looked at him, which was directly, without flinching, without the slight backward lean that most people did when they clocked his size and his scarred hands and the particular blankness of his expression. She looked at him like he was a person. "Thank you," she said, just that. 2 words, simply and sincerely spoken, as if she meant them and knew that he might not hear them otherwise, as if she had considered saying something more elaborate and decided that the truth was simpler than that. Gideon Yates, who had spoken to more horses than people in 3 years and who had not once in all that time been thanked by a passenger, opened his mouth and could not find a single word in the entire English language. She gave him a small, warm nod. Then she picked up her bag from where it had landed on the gravel bar and she walked up the bank toward Hennessy Station, and he stood in the river shallows and watched her go. He thought about it for weeks. He thought about it on the cold mornings when he rose before dawn to check the water level, and he thought about it in the evenings when he sat on the porch of the crossing keeper's shack and listened to the coyotes argue. He thought about it when he was hauling coaches, and when he was mending harness, and when he was lying on his back on his narrow cot staring at the ceiling, which was most nights, because sleep had never come easily to Gideon Yates and had become especially elusive since that Thursday in April. 2 words, "thank you," said by a woman whose name he did not know, who had gotten on whatever westbound stage departed Hennessy Station the following morning and disappeared into the territory as completely as if the plains had swallowed her. He told himself it was nothing. He told himself he was a simple man with simple needs and no business being haunted by a pair of brown eyes. He told himself a great many sensible things in those weeks, and none of them helped at all. It was Jonas Pittman, the freight agent at Hennessy, who told him her name. Gideon had not asked. He was emphatic about that, at least to himself. He had not asked. He had merely come to the station on legitimate business, the settlement of a disputed toll payment from the Drummond Company, and Jonas Pittman was a man who talked the way some rivers ran, which was constantly and without apparent regard for where he was going. "That woman who came through last month on the crossing incident," Jonas said, sorting his papers in the wrong order as he always did. "You know which one. The quiet one. Drummond tells me she nearly got swept away." "No one got swept away," Gideon said. "Well, nearly. Her name is Turner, Olive Turner, schoolteacher, heading out to take a position in Caldwell." Jonas squinted at a manifest. "Course she's been and gone now. Nice woman, very composed, you know the type, the ones that don't flap about. Olive Turner." Gideon filed the name away with such forced casualness that it immediately became the loudest thing in his head. Caldwell was 40 miles north. It was a cattle town, a rough and busy place at the end of the Kisham Trail, with saloons and stockyards and the particular type of violence that attached itself to places where large amounts of money changed hands quickly, and where men with guns came to spend what they'd earned during long drives through empty country. It was not, by any reasonable measure, a good place for a schoolteacher named Olive Turner to be. It was also none of Gideon Yates' business. He thought about it for 3 more weeks. Then fate, or something that wore fate's clothing, intervened. Gideon had a sister. Her name was Clara, and she lived in Caldwell, and she had been writing him increasingly urgent letters about a property dispute that was threatening her house. Clara's husband, a decent man named Errol, had died of a fever 2 winters back, leaving her with a small house and a parcel of land, and a neighbor named Silas Wicker who had decided, upon Errol's death, that the property line had always been a matter of interpretation. Gideon had put off going to Caldwell because he put off everything that required him to spend time among crowds of people. But Clara's last letter had mentioned a lawyer and a court date and the possibility of losing the house, and that was the end of his deliberating. He arrived in Caldwell on the 1st of June, which was a Tuesday, with his horse and his bedroll and his one decent shirt that he had ironed badly with a camp iron and would not iron again. He found Clara's house on the eastern edge of town, a small, neat, white-painted structure with a garden that was determinedly alive despite the summer heat, because Clara had always been stubborn about gardens. She met him at the gate and hugged him hard, which he endured because she was Clara and he would endure anything for Clara. "You look terrible," she said, which was her version of affection. "I look fine. You look like you haven't slept since April." He had not slept well since April, but he did not intend to explain why, so he carried his bedroll inside and they sat at her kitchen table, and she explained the dispute with Silas Wicker in the exhaustive detail that Clara brought to everything, and Gideon listened and tried to focus, and kept thinking about a woman named Olive Turner somewhere in this rough, loud, busy town. He went into Caldwell the next morning to find the lawyer Clara used, a small spare man named Addison who had an office above the dry goods store and who seemed competent despite the chaos of his filing system. They talked for an hour about the property boundary and the relevant survey records and what could reasonably be argued before a county judge. It was useful, and it gave Gideon something to think about other than April. He was coming down the stairs from Addison's office when he heard a voice that stopped him on the second-to-last step, with the same physical totality, as the Cimarron River hitting him in the chest. "I specifically ordered the McGuffey readers," the voice said, with a patience that had clearly been exercised many times that morning and was running low. "All 6 grades. That was the order placed through the school board in March." "Well, ma'am, we only got in the first 2 grades," said a man Gideon recognized as Pete Howell from the dry goods store, sounding the way men sounded when they were trying to be helpful and failing. "Supply out of Wichita's been slow. The school opens in 3 weeks, Mr. Howell. I have children who are ready to read, and I have nothing for them to read with." Gideon came down the last step. He could see her now, past the display of bolts and the hanging coils of rope. She stood at the counter with her back to him, dark hair neatly pinned, wearing a light gray dress that was practical rather than fashionable, and she was holding a list in her left hand that she had clearly written very precisely, and that was not being honored. She was smaller than he remembered. Or perhaps he had simply misremembered, inflating her in his mind over the weeks of thinking about her until she had become something larger than a person. But she was real. She was here. She was Olive Turner, and she was arguing about school books in Caldwell, Kansas, and Gideon Yates was standing 6 feet behind her, breathing carefully. He should have walked out. He should have completed his errand, tipped his hat to Pete Howell, and left without speaking to anyone. That would have been the sensible thing, the right thing, the thing that matched his actual life, which did not include women named Olive Turner. He said, "The book distributor in Wichita, Hale & Sons. They keep a warehouse stock. If you telegraph them directly with the school board's authorization, they'll put together an order inside a week." There was a pause. She turned around. She looked at him with those same brown eyes that had been visiting his dreams for 8 weeks, and he saw the recognition happen behind them, the slight widening, the rapid processing, and then something that might have been surprise or might have been something he didn't dare name. "The crossing," she said. "Yes, ma'am. You were at the Cimarron in April. I worked the crossing." She studied him for a moment with that same direct, unhurried attention she had given the river back in April. And Gideon had the sensation of being assessed by someone who was very good at assessment and very honest about what they found. "The telegraph office is on Main Street," she said, and there was the beginning of something at the corner of her mouth that was not quite a smile yet but was working toward one. "Would you happen to know if they're efficient?" "Reasonably," he said. "They lose things occasionally. What town in this territory does not lose things occasionally?" She said, and that was when the near smile became an actual one, small and genuine, and Gideon's brain, which was normally quite reliable, temporarily ceased its basic functions. Pete Howell watched this exchange with the open curiosity of a man with nothing else to do. "I'm Olive Turner," she said. "I teach at the new school on Hickory Street." "Gideon Yates," he said. "I'm here about a property matter for my sister." They shook hands, which in 1878 was not something a man and a woman did as a matter of course unless they were conducting business. But Olive Turner seemed to operate by a slightly different version of the social rules, not carelessly, but deliberately, as though she had examined each convention and kept the ones she found useful and quietly set aside the ones she did not. Her hand was small in his, and she did not flinch at the roughness of his palm or the width of his grip. "Do you know Caldwell well?" she asked. "Some," he said. "I grew up not far from here." "Then perhaps you could tell me which of the 2 hardware stores is less likely to sell me inferior nails for the shelving I'm trying to build." He told her. He also told her about the telegraph office and the general temperament of the postmaster, and the better of the 2 restaurants on account of Clara eating at both and providing detailed reports. And somehow, by the end of it, they were standing outside on the wooden sidewalk in the June heat, and the conversation had moved well past nails and school books into territory that Gideon couldn't have anticipated and wouldn't have dared to plan. She asked him about the crossing. Not the incident in April specifically, but the work itself, what it meant to make that passage safe, what the river was like at different times of year. She asked with genuine curiosity, not the polite kind that expected a short answer and a graceful exit. She listened to what he said. She asked follow-up questions that demonstrated she had been listening. No one asked Gideon Yates about his work with genuine curiosity. People were grateful when he hauled them through the water, in the same way they were grateful when a storm passed without striking them, briefly and then not at all. They did not wonder what it was like to stand in the current and hold on. She wondered. They stood on that sidewalk for 40 minutes. He knew because the church bell rang at 11, and it was past 11:30 when she said she needed to get to the school before noon, and he said he needed to get back to his sisters, and they went their separate ways down Caldwell's dusty Main Street, and Gideon walked 4 steps and then stopped and turned back. "Miss Turner." She turned. She was wearing a wide-brimmed hat against the sun, and it threw her face into shadow, but not enough shadow to hide her expression. "If the telegraph doesn't reach Hale and Sons fast enough," he said, "there's a freighter out of Medicine Lodge who sometimes comes through Hennessy. He carries school goods for the Indian Agency. He might have extras." She looked at him steadily for a moment. "I'm grateful," she said, and it was the same thing as April, just different words, but it had the same quality of being meant entirely, without performance, without social obligation, purely because she was. He thought about her for the rest of the day, which was not new, but now it was worse because he had context. He knew the way she held her list. He knew she built her own shelving. He knew she was practical and direct and had an almost unsettling capacity for attention, for truly attending to something, be it a river or a conversation or a man who worked the crossings and did not quite know what to do with being noticed. Clara noticed that he was distracted at dinner. "What happened to you today?" she asked, passing the biscuits. "Nothing. I talked to Addison. And I went to the dry goods store." Clara put the biscuit plate down and looked at him the way only sisters can look at brothers, which is to say with full knowledge and zero mercy. "Gideon, you have the face of a man who ran straight into his own destiny and is trying to walk it back." "I don't know what that means." "Yes, you do," said Clara, and went back to her dinner. He went to the schoolhouse on Hickory Street the next morning on the pretext of asking Olive whether she'd reached the telegraph office, which was a thin pretext because she was clearly a capable woman who could manage a telegraph without assistance. But she did not call him on it. She was on her knees in the back of the schoolroom, surrounded by planks of wood, and was attempting to fit a shelf bracket into a joint that wasn't quite right, and when he appeared in the doorway she looked up and said, "Do you know anything about woodworking?" He did, in fact, know quite a bit about woodworking. His father had been a carpenter, and Gideon had spent his boyhood in sawdust and joints, and the satisfaction of things fitting together the way they were supposed to. He spent that morning building shelves. It was the most comfortable morning he had spent in recent memory, maybe in years, maybe in longer than he wanted to count. They talked and they didn't talk in equal measure, the silence between them easy in a way that silence usually was not for Gideon, who carried his quiet like armor, and found that other people were made uncomfortable by it. Olive was not uncomfortable. She handed him boards when he needed them and asked about the grain of the wood when something interested her and told him about the school district's politics with a dry wit that made him laugh once, which startled them both. "You don't laugh much," she observed. "Not often," he agreed. Why? He thought about it honestly because she deserved an honest answer. "It got trained out of me," he said. "Long story. We have 2 more shelves to build," she said simply. "If you want." He looked at her. She was not pushing. She was not prying. She was simply leaving space, the way you left space for something that needed room to come out on its own, the way a good person did when they suspected that someone across from them was carrying more than they showed. He told her about the long story in pieces, over the 2 remaining shelves and the lunch break and the afternoon. He told her about the years after his father died when he'd run with men whose purpose and whose methods he'd known were wrong but whose company had felt like belonging, which was something he'd needed desperately and had mistaken for a thing worth compromising for. He told her about the robbery that had gone wrong, the man who had been hurt, the 3 months he'd spent in the Wichita County Jail thinking about what he was. He told her about coming out of that and finding the crossing work, and the solitude, and the gradual understanding that some people were built for certain kinds of service, and he seemed to be built for the kind that involved putting his body between danger and harm. She listened to all of it without the small, retreating adjustments most people made when the word jail appeared in a story. She did not pretend it was not there. She did not tell him it was in the past and didn't matter. She acknowledged it directly. "That took something," she said, "changing direction like that. It took losing the thing I thought I wanted," he said, "which is a different thing." "It usually is," she said quietly, and something in her voice told him she was not speaking theoretically, that she had her own version of that particular education, and he wanted to ask, but he had already said more about himself than he had said to anyone in 3 years, and he did not want to be greedy. He finished the shelving. He stood back and looked at it, and it was good work, square and solid, the kind of thing that would hold books for a long time. She stood next to him and looked at it too. "It's wonderful," she said. "You're very good at this." "I'm good at things that require force and patience," he said. "Those are not small things," she said. "Most people have one or the other, not both." He left the schoolhouse at 4 o'clock and walked back to Clara's and sat on the porch and understood with a clarity that was almost frightening that he was in very serious trouble. Clara brought him coffee and sat in the other chair and said nothing, which was its own kind of eloquence. "She's a school teacher," he said finally. "So I hear," said Clara. "She's educated, sensible, she's going to build something here. And I live at a river crossing 40 miles south," he said. "I haul coaches for toll money." "I sleep in a shack." Clara sipped her coffee. "I notice you know a lot about her already." He did not respond to this. "Gideon," Clara said, in the voice she used when she was going to say something he needed to hear whether he wanted to or not. "The thing you're describing as an obstacle is geography. The thing you're calling a reason it can't work is circumstances. Both of those are the kind of things that move when people decide to move them. It's not that simple." "Of course it is," said Clara. "The complicated part is deciding what you want. The simple part is then doing what's necessary to get there. You've never been afraid of what's necessary." He thought about that for a long time after she went inside. He saw Olive again the next day, which happened because they both arrived at the post office at the same time. And the day after that, which happened because she was at the hardware store buying additional brackets and he was there getting wire for Clara's fence. And the day after that, which was a Sunday and had no particular pretense at all, he simply went to the church on Oak Street where Clara attended services, and Olive Turner was sitting 3 rows ahead, wearing a blue dress, and she turned around when the congregation settled and saw him and nodded, and he nodded back, and spent the entire sermon looking at the back of her hat. They walked after the service. Not together precisely, but together in the way that happens when two people end up on the same street going the same direction and slow their pace to match, and find that the conversation is easier than stopping would be. They walked to the edge of town where the prairie opened up, wide and golden in the Sunday light, the kind of view that made a person feel both very small and strangely grateful. The grass moved in long waves in the south wind. The sky was the particular shade of blue that existed only at altitude and in June. "Do you miss the crossing?" she asked. "I miss the river," he said honestly. "I don't miss being alone with it." She looked at him sideways under the brim of her hat. "You didn't answer the question." He smiled, which was still surprising enough that she noticed it. "I miss the river," he said again, differently. "I don't miss having nothing else to miss." She looked back at the prairie. "I came from Ohio," she said after a while. "My father was a minister. My mother taught me to read before I started school. I thought I wanted to stay in Ohio and teach at the school I'd grown up attending." She paused. "I was engaged for 2 years to a man named Hartley. He was very respectable and very kind and very dull, and I liked him fine and did not love him, And that might have been enough, except that the week before the wedding he told me he expected me to stop teaching once we were married because a wife of his standing had no need of employment. "So you left," Gideon said. "I left," she said simply. "I found a position in Kansas through the school board registry, packed 2 trunks, and got on a stage that nearly put me in the Cimarron River." "Nearly," he said. "Nearly," she agreed, and she looked at him again, and there was that direct, unhesitating quality in her gaze that had been doing things to his composure since April. "I've been thinking about that crossing," she said, "about what it meant that you were there." He waited. "I've been thinking about the fact that I was frightened," she said carefully, "which I almost never am, and then I looked at you in the water and I was not frightened anymore. That's a significant thing." "The water's not deep at the gravel bar," he said, because he was still the kind of man who deflected even now. "Gideon," she said, "I am not talking about the water depth." The sound of his name in her voice, just his name said like that, did something to the inside of his chest that he was entirely unprepared for. He looked at her. She looked at him. The prairie wind moved between them, and the grass bent and recovered and bent again in the long, easy rhythm that the plains had always had, older than either of them, indifferent and beautiful. "I'm going to be in Caldwell for another 3 weeks," he said. "My sister's property case goes before the judge." "3 weeks," she said. "If it's all right," he said, "I'd like to spend some of that time with you." It was not elegant. He did not have the language for elegant, but she looked at him, and whatever she found there satisfied her the way the truth always satisfied Olive Turner, because she was a person who preferred it to the alternative. "I think that would be very agreeable," she said. Those 3 weeks were the finest of Gideon Yates' adult life, and he knew it while they were happening, which was a gift he did not take for granted. They ate supper together twice a week at the restaurant Clara had approved, a clean, quiet place run by a woman named Mrs. Huang, who had come from California and who made excellent soup and minded her own business. They walked on Sundays. Olive let him come to the schoolroom in the mornings when he had nothing pressing, and he finished the shelving and built a supply cabinet and repaired the door latch and a broken window frame. And in exchange, she talked to him about books she loved with the kind of enthusiasm that made the books sound genuinely vital, like things you might need in an emergency. She read aloud to him sometimes, when they were done working and the afternoon was going golden. Poetry mostly, and one novel that she carried in her bag, a battered copy of Jane Eyre that she'd had since she was 16. He had not read novels. His reading was practical, survey maps and freight records and the occasional newspaper. But listening to her read was a different thing entirely. It was less about the story than about her voice moving through it, her feeling for what the words were doing, the way she paused where the pause mattered. He told Clara about Jane Eyre one evening, and Clara put her hand over her mouth and looked away and made a sound that was not entirely a cough. The property case resolved in Clara's favor in the 2nd week of June, which meant Gideon had no practical reason to stay in Caldwell. He told Clara he was going to stay the 3rd week anyway. Clara said naturally, without looking up from her mending. He asked Olive to supper on the last Thursday of the 3 weeks at Mrs. Huang's, and he wore the decent shirt and made a better attempt at it with the iron this time. And he arrived at her boarding house at 6 o'clock to find her in a dress the color of pine needles that he had not seen before, and which made his original intention to simply have a pleasant supper, and perhaps say some of the things he had been thinking for 3 weeks seem suddenly inadequate and terrifying in equal measure. They ate. Mrs. Huang's soup was excellent as always. They talked about the school, which was to open in 2 weeks, and about the survey dispute, which had been settled by a county surveyor who confirmed that Silas Wicker had been operating on optimistic assumptions about the property line. They talked about the news from the territory, which was difficult, as it often was, the pressure on the Cheyenne and Arapaho, whose lands continued to shrink under forces that law and custom seemed unwilling to restrain. Olive had views on this that were clear and carefully considered, and that Gideon respected, though he was a man who had spent more time in proximity to those circumstances than she had and knew they were more complicated in practice than any clean argument could contain. They talked about that tension too, respectfully, neither capitulating nor insisting. After supper they walked, because they always walked, and the evening was soft and the light on the buildings was the color of old honey, and Gideon had 3 days left in Caldwell, and he had not said any of the things he needed to say. "I've been offered a position," he said. She looked at him. "Wichita County, deputy surveyor. It's indoors mostly, paperwork and the occasional field work. It pays a salary instead of tolls." "That sounds like a significant change," she said carefully. "It is. Are you considering it?" He stopped walking. She stopped beside him. They were on the edge of the residential street where her boarding house stood, the last of the daylight making shadows from the cottonwood trees that lined the road, long and blue on the dust. "I'm considering it because of you," he said. "Which is something I should tell you directly because I don't know how to be otherwise. I have been thinking about you since April, since the crossing, since you looked at me and said thank you and meant it. I have been thinking about you every day, and I am not good at pretending that's a simple thing or a small thing because it is neither." He had never said so many words in sequence about something personal. He felt exposed in a way that was close to painful. But she was watching him with those eyes, and she deserved the truth more than he deserved comfort. "I am not asking you for anything specific," he said. "I know my life as it stands is not much to offer. I know I am rough in places that you are not, and I know that I carry things from my past that are not entirely resolved. But I am honest, and I am steady, and I am not going anywhere unless you tell me to." Olive Turner stood in the blue shadow of the cottonwood trees and looked at Gideon Yates for a long moment. "You know what I thought," she said, "when I saw you in that river." He shook his head. "I thought, here is a man who does not quit," she said. "I've never forgotten it, not the size of you or the strength of you, though those were remarkable. I thought about the not quitting, the way you just kept walking forward." She paused. "I would like to know a man like that. I would like to know him very well." He reached for her hand carefully. "The way you reached for something you understood was not guaranteed to you." She let him take it. Her hand was warm and small and utterly steady in his, and the evening around them was so quiet they could hear the cottonwood leaves talking to each other in the light wind. "I'll write to you," he said, "when I go back to the crossing, if I go back." "Write to me," she said. And Gideon, his name again, he would never get used to it. "Don't go back unless you need to. I have been in this town 3 weeks, and you are already the best reason to stay in it." He left on a Saturday morning as planned. He said goodbye to Clara at her gate, and she hugged him again fiercely and said very quietly into his shoulder, "Don't be an idiot about this. You deserve good things. Take the good thing." He rode south to the Cimarron crossing, and he spent 2 weeks settling his affairs there, which meant talking to the Drummond Company about the new ferry operation they were planning that would eventually make his particular service obsolete, and collecting his tools and his few books and the trunk of clothes that fit in a single layer. He wrote to Olive twice in those 2 weeks. He was not a natural writer. His letters were sparse and factual, reporting the river level and the status of the ferry plans, and the fact that he had found a younger man willing to take over the crossing work. But at the end of the second letter he wrote, "I think about the cottonwood trees on your street. I think about Thursday evenings. I am coming back to Caldwell as soon as I've cleared what I need to clear here, if you'll still have me." He sealed it and sent it north with the mail carrier, and felt more vulnerable than he had felt standing in the Cimarron at chest height. Her reply came in 4 days. It was longer than his letters, 3 full pages in her precise, even handwriting, telling him about the school opening and a parent who had come in to complain about the reading materials, and a child named Benjamin who was 6 years old and already reading at twice his grade level, and who was the kind of student who made the whole enterprise of teaching feel like the most important work in the world. And at the end, in the same direct way she did everything, "Yes, I will still have you. Gideon, I will have you very much. Come when you're ready and not before, but don't take too long. He was in Caldwell by the end of July. He found rooms above the saddler's shop on the east side of town and took the surveyor's deputy position, which involved more arithmetic than he'd anticipated and more writing than the title suggested, and which suited him reasonably well. The deputy surveyor he worked under, a methodical man named Arthur Crane, seemed pleased to have an assistant who could both do the arithmetic and carry the heavy equipment without complaint. The salary was modest but sufficient. He courted Olive Turner the way he did most things, which was carefully and without pretense, and with a degree of seriousness that she received without being made uncomfortable by it. He took her to supper on Thursdays. He walked with her on Sundays. He fixed things at the school because there was always something that needed fixing, and he was there and capable. He met her students occasionally when he arrived at the end of the school day, and the children responded to him, the way children always responded to very large, very quiet adults, with a kind of tentative fascination that gradually became confidence. Benjamin, the reading prodigy, declared him very tall the first time they met, which Gideon acknowledged as accurate. He met Olive's colleagues, and she met Clara, who liked Olive immediately and without reservation, which Clara expressed by inviting her to dinner, and then arguing with her about Jane Eyre for 2 hours with visible enjoyment. Olive argued back with equal energy, and Clara afterwards told Gideon that he should absolutely not let this woman get away, a recommendation that Gideon did not require but received gratefully. The weeks in Caldwell were different from anything that had come before in his life. Not easier precisely, because life in a cattle town was never exactly easy, and the violence that the end of the trail season brought was real and sometimes close. In August, a man was shot in the street 2 blocks from Olive's school, a dispute over a card game that ended with a death and a funeral, and a grim reminder that the civilization being built in this part of Kansas was fragile and partial and held together by habit and hope as much as by law. Olive was not naive about this. She had been in Caldwell long enough to see what it was. She taught the children of cowboys and merchants and women who worked in the saloons and women who took in laundry, and she treated all of them the same, which in 1878 was not a universal practice, and which earned her some friction and some respect in roughly equal measure. Gideon admired this about her, the refusal to operate on a tiered system of human worth, the same way he admired her stubbornness about the school supplies and her patience with the Board of Education, and her complete inability to be daunted by anything that was simply hard rather than genuinely impossible. She was stubborn in the way that very clear-sighted people are stubborn, not rigidity but commitment, the unwillingness to abandon what she understood to be right simply because it was inconvenient. He told her this one evening in September, when the heat had begun to leave the days and the nights were cool, and the cottonwood trees were turning yellow at the edges. They were sitting on the porch of Clara's house after supper, a comfortable arrangement that had become habitual, and the question of their future was hanging in the air between them in the pleasant way that a question hangs when both parties are fairly certain of the answer and are simply taking the time to make sure of it. "I want to marry you," he said. He had thought about how to say it for approximately 3 weeks and had concluded that there was no version more honest than the plain one. She looked at him across the 2 feet of porch between them. Clara's lamp was burning through the window behind them, and the yellow light of it fell across her face, and she was so entirely herself, so precisely and specifically Olive Turner, that it struck him again as it had struck him all along, the extraordinary specific reality of her. "I want that too," she said. "I want it very much. I also want to keep teaching. I know that. I want to make sure you know that," she said steadily. Hartley did not, and that was the thing that broke it. "I will not give up the school, Gideon. It matters to me as much as anything I know how to do." "I would not ask you to," he said. "I would never ask you to." She looked at him for a moment longer, measuring something, and then she nodded once, the same small, decisive nod she had given him at the Cimarron crossing when the water was still running off him and the world had been very cold and loud. "Then yes," she said. "Absolutely yes." Clara came out of the house at that moment with the coffee and looked at their faces and set the pot down on the rail with a thump and said, "Finally, for the love of all that is decent." And then she hugged them both, which was extraordinary, because Clara was not a woman who hugged people casually, and Gideon found that the feeling in his chest was so large it was almost uncomfortable. This abundant, overfull warmth that had no name he knew of except that maybe it was happiness, which he had not trusted for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like when it was real and not a performance or a mistake. They were married in October. It was a simple ceremony at the church on Oak Street, on a Saturday morning when the cottonwood trees were fully golden and the air smelled of wood smoke and dried grass. Clara stood with Olive and Arthur Crane stood with Gideon and Mrs. Huang made a wedding cake that was better than anything a person had any right to expect, dense and sweet, and flavored with something that Mrs. Huang declined to name. Benjamin, the reading prodigy, attended with his mother and was deeply invested in the proceedings, asking at one point in a clear and carrying voice whether the wedding was like the ones in books, and Olive said yes, very like, and Benjamin declared this satisfactory. The minister was a man named Reverend Alcott, who had known both Hartley and Olive's father, which Olive had handled by writing a very polite and very firm letter to the Caldwell School Board's recommended minister instead. The ceremony was plain and honest and well attended by people who had come to know Olive in her months of teaching, and by the handful of people who had come to know Gideon in his months of being in Caldwell, and being the sort of man you noticed eventually. When it was done, and the rice had been thrown and Clara had cried, which she did with great dignity and denied immediately, Gideon walked out of the church into the October morning with Olive on his arm, and he thought briefly, vividly, about the Cimarron crossing and the Thursday in April, and the woman who had looked at him directly and said thank you. And he thought that there was a long distance between that moment and this one, and every step of it had been necessary and worth it. They took a brief wedding trip to Wichita, 3 days, which was what could be managed given the school schedule and Arthur Crane's survey commitments. Wichita in October was busy and bright, the cattle drives mostly done for the year, the stockyards winding down. They stayed at a hotel that was clean if not luxurious, and they went to the theater one evening, a traveling company doing a production of Shakespeare that was enthusiastic if occasionally confused about which play it was performing, and Olive laughed at the wrong moments in a way that made everyone around them relax and laugh too. On the last evening in Wichita, they sat in the hotel room and Olive read aloud from Jane Eyre, which she had brought because of course she had, and Gideon listened with his head against the wall, and the lamp burning low, and the night sounds of Wichita coming through the window, and thought that he would like this for the rest of his life, this specific domestic peace, her voice moving through words she loved while the world went on outside being whatever it was, and they were here, in this room, in this quiet. They went home to Caldwell, and to the house they had rented on Hickory Street, 2 blocks from the school, a modest but solid place with a proper kitchen and a parlor and a room that could eventually be a second bedroom, and a yard where Olive immediately planted a kitchen garden despite the lateness of the season, on the grounds that there was no harm in preparing the soil. Life settled into the shape that good lives settle into, not dramatic, not simple either, but layered and full. Olive's school grew through the fall and the winter, enrollment increasing as more families arrived in Caldwell, with the second wave of settlement that came once a town proved its persistence. She had 23 students by January, ranging from 6 to 14 years, and she ran the school with the same combination of genuine warmth and quiet, uncompromising expectation that had made her effective from the start. Gideon's work with Arthur Crane expanded too. He became useful for the more physically demanding survey operations, the ones that required long days on horseback across rough terrain, and he was good at the political negotiations that sometimes accompanied boundary work, disputes between ranchers and homesteaders, and the county itself about where a line actually fell. He had a steadiness in those situations that men in argument responded to, not the false calm of indifference but the genuine calm of someone who had no stake in anyone being wrong and simply wanted the thing resolved. It was its own kind of strength, different from what the crossing had required but drawn from the same place. They had disagreements, as people who live together have disagreements. Olive was set in her routines, and Gideon was occasionally distant in the way that men who have lived alone for a long time are distant, requiring prompting to share what was in his head. She was direct about this when it happened, not unkindly but clearly, because she had learned from the example of Hartley that indirection was a slow poison, and she would not practice it in her own house. He learned to say what he was thinking before it calcified into silence. She learned to give him a little longer than her instinct suggested before she asked. These were not dramatic adjustments. They were the kind of small, persistent work that real partnerships required, the daily maintenance of the thing you decided to build. And they did it without resentment, because they both understood that it was the work and not a sign that the foundation was flawed. In the spring of 1879, Olive told him she was expecting a child. It was a Sunday morning and they were at Clara's for breakfast, the informal weekly breakfast that had become a tradition since the wedding, and Clara had made biscuits and the coffee was very good and the Sunday light was coming through the kitchen windows in pale yellow sheets, and Olive said it quietly, with her hands around her coffee cup, watching his face. He was very still for a moment. Then he took the coffee cup gently out of her hands and replaced it with his hands, holding them carefully, and he said nothing for a moment because he did not trust his voice to be steady, and then he said, "Are you all right?" "I am very well," she said. "Are you frightened?" She considered this with the honesty she brought to everything. "A little," she said. "Are you?" "Yes," he said immediately. She laughed, which broke the tension of the moment into something warm and livable, and Clara, who had been pretending to tend the stove, turned around with a face that was doing a great many things at once, most of them happy. The pregnancy was uncomplicated, though the summer of 1879 was brutally hot and Olive taught through July, and then arranged for a substitute through the fall, which cost her considerably in terms of being away from her work, but which her body and her good sense required. She read obsessively, which was not new. She built a shelf in the baby's room herself, smaller than the school shelves but no less carefully measured, and she stocked it with the McGuffey readers that had eventually arrived from Hale and Sons, not because a newborn would read them but because she intended to start reading to this child as early as possible, and she wanted the books present from the beginning. Gideon built a crib. He built it from white oak, which was heavy and hard to work but which would last, and he joined it without nails because he wanted it to be something that could be handed down, and he spent 3 weeks on it in the evenings while Olive read in the parlor and Clara came to inspect it twice and declared it excellent both times. Their son was born in December of 1879, on a cold night with snow falling soft and thick on Caldwell and the streets gone quiet and white. Clara was there. The doctor was there. Gideon was permitted to remain, which was not universal practice but which Olive had made clear was not negotiable, because she wanted him present, and what Olive Turner made clear was not negotiable tended to remain so. He was a large baby, which was not a surprise given his father, and he was healthy and vocal about his initial assessment of the world, which was mixed. They named him Errol, after Gideon's father and Clara's husband both, which made Clara cry in the same fierce, dignified way she had cried at the wedding. Having Errol in the house changed everything and nothing. The fundamental texture of their lives remained what it had been, full and purposeful and grounded in the same routines of work and supper and Sunday mornings at Clara's. But there was this additional person now, this small specific person who had inherited Olive's brown eyes and Gideon's tendency toward quiet observation, who regarded the world from his cradle with an expression of focused concentration that both of them found hilarious and moving. Olive returned to the school in March of 1880, with arrangements in place for Errol to be with a neighbor woman named Mrs. Folsom, who had 4 children of her own and who managed infants with the ease of someone who had simply done it so many times that it had become a kind of ambient skill. Olive nursed him in the mornings and the evenings and gave up very little of what made her herself in the process, because she was Olive Turner, and she had decided from the beginning that having a child would be an addition to her life rather than a replacement for it, and she organized things accordingly. Gideon watched this with the ongoing low-grade astonishment that had become his standard state since April of 1878. He watched her manage the school and the baby and the house and the kitchen garden and her correspondence with the school board and her letters to her family in Ohio and her continued reading, which she maintained at a pace that staggered him, and she did all of it without seeming to strain under it, the way a river runs, fast in some places and slower in others, but always moving, always in the direction it had decided to go. He told her this once, that she was like a river. What kind of river? She asked instantly and with interest. A clear one, he said. You can see the bottom. She looked at him for a moment. That's the loveliest thing you've ever said to me. I mean it. I know you mean it, she said. That's why it's lovely. In the summer of 1880, the property dispute with Sela's Wicker reared up again at Clara's, this time involving a water right that Wicker claimed ran with the disputed boundary. Gideon became involved in this through his survey work, providing the technical documentation that ultimately resolved the matter in Clara's favor for the second and apparently final time, after a conversation with Wicker that Gideon described as brief, and that Clara suspected was somewhat more pointed than brief, though she did not pursue the details. Wicker sold his property and moved to Newton the following spring, which solved the problem comprehensively. Clara, freed from the property anxiety that had dogged her since Errol's death, blossomed in ways that pleased Gideon considerably. She took in a boarder, a young woman who worked at the dry goods store, and she planted a larger garden, and she joined a women's study club that met on Wednesday evenings, and that she described to Gideon with great enthusiasm and considerable amusement at some of the more elaborate debates that occurred there. She also, quietly and without making a fuss about it, became very important to Errol, who at 18 months had discovered that his Aunt Clara was the source of the best biscuits and the most interesting stories and the most willing audience for his various demonstrations and experiments with gravity and sound. Clara, for her part, regarded Errol with the complete and unqualified affection that aunts are capable of extending to nephews in a way that parents sometimes find difficult, which is to say, without the complicated freight of responsibility. The school in 1880 and 1881 was where much of the drama in their lives actually lived, because schools in cattle towns were not peaceful institutions. There were parents who objected to the curriculum and parents who objected to each other's children being educated together, and parents who simply objected on principle to the authority of a young woman who was not from here. Olive handled all of this with a firmness that impressed Gideon every time he saw it. Not combative, but completely clear. The kind of clarity that came from knowing what you were doing and why you were doing it, and having the documentation to back up every decision you had made. There was a specific crisis in November of 1881 that illustrated this most vividly. A rancher named Cornell pulled his 3 children from the school after Olive declined to dismiss a student whose mother worked at one of the saloons. Cornell came to the school himself to present his argument, which was largely about his children being exposed to undesirable associations, and he was a large man, and he used his size the way some men used it, as a kind of pressure in itself. Gideon, who happened to be repairing the school fence at the time, was present for this conversation. He stood 15 feet away and let Olive handle it, because it was Olive's to handle, and she did not require or want his intervention. He watched her listen to Cornell with complete patience and complete attention, and then he watched her explain, simply and without heat, that the child in question had a right to education that superseded Cornell's personal comfort, and that if Cornell wished to educate his own children elsewhere, he was legally entitled to do so, and that she wished him and his family well. Cornell left, eventually, having been denied the argument he'd come looking for. His children were back at school the following Monday without explanation, which Olive received without commentary. Afterward, when the school day was done and they were walking home, Gideon said, "That was handled." "It was not difficult," she said. "He was not a bad man, he was a frightened one. Frightened men make a great deal of noise and then frequently go home." "You were not frightened." She glanced at him. "Gideon, I was a little frightened." "You didn't show it." "Showing it wouldn't have helped anything," she said simply. "And I had faith the situation was manageable." She paused. "I also knew you were at the fence." He looked at her. "I didn't need you to intervene," she said. "But knowing you were there was not nothing." He understood this perfectly because it was how he felt about everything. Not needing rescue, but the knowledge that someone was present, that there was a person who would not leave, who would not quit, who was there in the same simple and absolute way they had always been there. That was not a small thing. That was one of the largest things there was. In 1882, they had a second child. A girl this time, which pleased Errol enormously when he began to understand what having a sister meant. Mostly that there was someone smaller than him in the house for the first time, and this seemed to him a great novelty. They named her June, because she was born in June, and because Olive had always loved the month and the warmth and the particular green that the countryside turned in late spring, that deep, saturated, almost improbable green that made you feel the world was trying. June was nothing like Errol in temperament. Where Errol was observational and quiet, June was immediate and loud, and had opinions about everything from a very early age. She expressed these opinions with a clarity that Olive found professionally familiar and Gideon found genuinely entertaining. By the time she was 2, she was already trying to give instructions to anyone who would sit still long enough, and by 3 she had organized her stuffed animals into a classroom arrangement that strongly suggested she had been paying attention at the school in ways that had not been apparent. Life moved. The seasons turned. Caldwell grew and changed, the cattle trade evolving, some years good and some years difficult, the social landscape of the town shifting as settlement brought different people and different pressures. The violence of the cattle drive years diminished as the drives themselves diminished, the railroads changing everything, as they always changed everything, reorganizing the geography of commerce and movement in ways that made some places bigger, and some places smaller, and some things that had existed simply not necessary anymore. The Cimarron crossing itself became less essential by 1883, when the new bridge was completed, which was what Gideon had anticipated when he left the work. The bridge was practical and permanent and excellent and entirely unromantic, doing its job without drama or risk or the particular quality of passage that a crossing required. Gideon felt no nostalgia for it, or if he felt some, he did not make much of it. He had built a different life, and the river was still there, still running, still doing what rivers did, which was enough. His survey work had grown into something more substantial by 1883. Arthur Crane had retired and Gideon had taken the full county surveyor position, which came with a proper salary and a small office on the main street, and a level of civic standing that he wore lightly but took seriously. He was good at the work. He was honest in it, which mattered in a field where the incentives for dishonesty were real and the consequences of inaccuracy could last for generations, because a property line poorly drawn was a problem that had a way of enduring. He was known in Caldwell now, which was a different experience than being known at the crossing had been. At the crossing he had been known for his body, for what his body could do, for the function he served. In Caldwell he was known for his judgment, for his word, for the fact that his measurements could be trusted and his assessments were fair, and his manner, which was still and would always be quiet and slightly blunt, was understood to come from honesty rather than coldness. People came to him with disputes, not always official ones. Neighbors with fence arguments. Families with inheritance questions about land. The occasional more complicated thing involving the large ranches that were consolidating in the county. The operations that were buying up smaller claims, and whose relationship to the existing survey records was sometimes creative in ways that Gideon found it professionally necessary to correct. Olive watched this dimension of his life with the same attention she brought to everything, and she asked him about it at supper when the children were in bed, the questions that helped her understand what he was actually doing and what it cost him, because there were situations where doing the right thing had a price, and she wanted to know about those so she could be present for them. He told her. He had learned, through 3 years of marriage, that telling her things was not a burden transferred but a weight shared, which made it lighter rather than heavier, which was not what he had expected, and which continued to surprise him pleasantly. There was a situation in 1884 that tested this particularly. A large ranch operation called the Dalton Consolidated, which was in the process of absorbing several smaller homestead claims in the county's north, retained a lawyer who presented Gideon with a set of survey documents that had been, in Gideon's professional assessment, substantially adjusted from their originals to expand the ranch's apparent holdings by approximately 300 acres into land that was under claim by 2 homesteading families named Polk and Stringer. Gideon submitted his findings to the county judge, which meant contradicting the Dalton Consolidated survey documentation, which meant making an institutional enemy of a large and well-resourced operation. The Dalton lawyer came to his office and was unpleasant about it, suggesting that a county surveyor who found against major landholders in the county tended to find his position insecure. Gideon listened to this to its conclusion, and then said that he had made his findings based on the original survey records and the current physical evidence, and that he stood by them, and that the lawyer was welcome to bring any counter-evidence he had to the court, and good afternoon. He told Olive about it that evening. She listened. When he was finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Are you worried about your position?" "Some," he said honestly. "If they do manage to pressure the county board," she said carefully, "we will be all right. You could work independently. Your reputation is solid. There are counties that don't have a surveyor at all." "I know. I'm not asking you to stand down," she said. "I would not ask that. I want to know you know we're not fragile." He looked at her across the kitchen table, in the lamplight of the house on Hickory Street that they had made into a home over 5 years of trying, with the children sleeping in the rooms above and the kitchen garden going dark outside the window and Clara's house a walk down the street and the school 2 blocks away, and he thought that fragile was possibly the last word that applied to any of it. "I know," he said. "I know we're not." The Dalton matter resolved in the court's finding in favor of the Polk and Stringer families, which was the correct finding, and the Dalton Consolidated adjusted its operations accordingly, and did not, in the event, attempt to dislodge Gideon from the county position. The Dalton lawyer did not return to Gideon's office. The Polk family sent a letter of thanks that Olive read aloud at supper, and Gideon listened to it with the particular quiet pleasure of work done right and mattered. In 1885, Clara fell in love. This happened gradually, and then all at once, the way Clara apparently did most things, with the proprietor of the hardware store on Main Street, a widower named Thomas Greer, who was steady and warm, and who had been finding increasingly elaborate reasons to spend time with Clara since approximately 1883. Clara denied this was happening until approximately February of 1885, at which point she arrived at Olive and Gideon's Sunday breakfast and announced that she and Thomas were getting married in the spring with the brisk efficiency of someone presenting a resolved problem rather than news. Gideon said nothing for a moment and then said, "Do you love him?" Clara looked at him. "Gideon, I am 51 years old and I have been a widow for 7 years and I have watched you find happiness when you had decided you were not suited for it. Yes, I love him." He stood up and hugged her. She let him, which was its own kind of communication. Olive cried, which she almost never did, and then blamed it on the coffee being too hot, which satisfied no one but was accepted. They were married in April, at the same church on Oak Street, with Olive standing with Clara and Gideon standing with Thomas and Errol and June in the front row. Errol solemn and June intensely curious about the ceremony's procedural elements and asking questions in a whisper that was not entirely a whisper. By 1886, Olive was carrying their third child. She was 34, Gideon was 38, and they had discussed the matter with the practicality that characterized most of their important discussions, weighing the school schedule and the house's capacity, and the fact that June at 4 and Errol at 6 were at ages that required a great deal of active attention. And then they had agreed that another child was what they wanted and proceeded on that basis. This baby was born in January of 1887. A boy, smaller than Errol had been but equally vocal in his first assessment of the world. They named him Oliver, which was Olive's grandfather's name and which she had not suggested but which Gideon proposed, sitting in the chair beside the bed after the birth while she held the baby and the winter morning came in through the window in pale flat light. "Oliver," she said, trying it. "If you don't like it," he said. "I love it," she said. "Gideon, I love it very much." Errol's reaction to Oliver was proprietary and tender in a way that made both his parents privately emotional. He was 7 now, a serious boy with his mother's capacity for careful attention and his father's quietness, and he took it upon himself to explain the world to his baby brother with a thoroughness that Olive found professionally admirable, and that Oliver responded to with the complete indifference of someone who had been in the world approximately 3 weeks. June's reaction was to declare herself Oliver's teacher and to begin immediately. The years that followed were the fullness of a life. Not without hardship, because no life is, and the Kansas plains in the late 1880s had their difficulties, drought years and market failures, and the ongoing turbulence of a frontier that was becoming something else, but had not yet finished becoming it. There were losses in those years, too. A family in Olive's school lost a father to a thrashing accident that left the children in precarious circumstances, that Olive and the school board addressed through a combination of extended enrollment support and community collection. There was a fire on Main Street in 1889 that took 3 buildings and narrowly missed the hardware store, which Thomas Greer rebuilt with the help of what seemed like half the town, Gideon among the first and most useful of the builders. There was grief, too, of the irreversible kind. Olive's father died in Ohio in the spring of 1888, and she cried for 3 days with a grief that was quiet and thorough, and that Gideon sat inside with her without trying to fix it, because he had learned that some things needed to be passed through rather than around, and being present while she passed through this one was what he could do and what she needed. She went to Ohio for the funeral, taking Errol with her because he was old enough and her family wanted to know him. Gideon stayed with June and Oliver and spent a week being more entirely responsible for 2 children than he had ever been, and found that he was, after a slight initial adjustment, equal to it, though June's organizational tendencies and Oliver's tendency to put things in his mouth created specific challenges that kept him productively occupied. When Olive came back from Ohio, she stood in the doorway of their house on Hickory Street with her traveling bag, and she looked more tired than he had seen her, thin in the way of people who have not been sleeping well, her eyes holding something that would take a while to settle. He took the bag from her and said nothing and simply put his arms around her, and she pressed her face against his shoulder and was still for a long time. "I'm glad you're here," she said. "I'm here," he said. "I'm always here." And that was sufficient because it was true, and it had always been true, and she had always known it, and the knowing was what mattered. The school on Hickory Street expanded in 1889, a second room added on the north side to accommodate the growing enrollment, and Olive was joined by a second teacher, a young man named Edward Foss who had come from Missouri with a teaching certificate and a tremendous enthusiasm for mathematics that Olive found both useful and occasionally exhausting. He was good with the older students, and she was able to spend more of her time with the younger ones, which was where her heart had always been, the 6- and 7-year-olds who were just finding out what words could do. Benjamin, the reading prodigy from the school's first year, was 16 in 1889 and had been reading everything Olive could put in front of him for the better part of 9 years. He was planning to go to Emporia State Normal School in the fall, which Olive had encouraged with the specific investment she put into students who showed what she called the mark, by which she meant the quality of wanting more than what was immediately available, not out of dissatisfaction, but out of genuine hunger for the world's contents. She wrote him a letter of recommendation that was 4 pages long, and that she allowed Gideon to read before she sent it. He read it in its entirety and then sat with it for a moment and said, "He is a very lucky person. Students do the work," she said automatically, which was something she always said. "Olive, he is very lucky to have had you." She received this with the slightly uncomfortable grace she always showed when someone acknowledged her directly, not deflecting it but not quite at ease with it either, the inverse of Gideon's own discomfort in April of 1878, which she had resolved by simply looking at him until it passed. "We are both lucky," she said finally, "that we found work that mattered and people who mattered in the same life. That's not nothing." "No," he said, "it's not nothing. It's very nearly everything." In 1890, when Errol was 10 and June was 8 and Oliver was 3, Gideon took them all back to the Cimarron crossing on a Sunday in May, when the river was running clear and the plains were green and the sky went on forever in every direction. It was a journey of a day each way, and they camped overnight, which June thought was the finest thing that had ever happened to her, and which Oliver was philosophically neutral about, and which Errol found interesting from the engineering perspective of how the camp was organized. The crossing had the bridge now, a timber structure that crossed the Cimarron with solid, unremarkable competence. But the gravel bar was still there on the far bank, and the current still ran fast and brown after rain, and the light on the water was the same light it had always been, indifferent and beautiful. Gideon stood at the bank and looked at the crossing and felt no particular nostalgia, the way he'd thought he might. He felt instead a kind of recognition, the same place but a different man standing in it, which was not the same as nostalgia. Nostalgia wished for the past. This was something else, more like gratitude, the acknowledgement that the past had been necessary and that it had led here, to this bank on this morning with these specific people who were his people. Olive came and stood beside him. The children were behind them, Errol examining the bridge structure, June wading in the shallows with her shoes off despite the temperature, Oliver sitting on a rock eating something. "Is it the same?" she asked. "More or less," he said. "Do you miss it?" He put his arm around her and she leaned against him with the ease of a decade of practice at this exact thing. "Not for 1 minute," he said. She laughed. The river ran. June yelled something about a crayfish. Errol called back with information about crayfish that was extensive and probably accurate. Oliver continued to eat whatever he was eating with complete philosophical contentment. The drive home the next day was long and dusty and cheerful. The children slept in the wagon bed by the time they reached the outskirts of Caldwell, and the evening was going violet at the edges, and the first few stars were appearing in the east, where the sky got dark first, and Gideon drove the wagon down the familiar road into the familiar town, and thought that this was what it was to have built something that held. Not dramatically, not in a rush. Step by step in a current that had tried more than once to take things sideways. But you held on and you walked forward, and eventually you came out on the other bank, and the thing you were carrying was intact. The house on Hickory Street received them with the particular welcome of a house that knows its people. Olive lit the lamp in the parlor while Gideon carried the sleeping Oliver inside, and Errol helped June with her boots at the door, and somewhere in Clara's house 2 streets over there was a light burning too, which was always comforting. The way a lighthouse is comforting, not because you're in danger, but because you know where the shore is. They put the children to bed and then sat in the parlor in the late evening quiet, and Olive had Jane Eyre in her lap, the same battered copy she'd carried from Ohio to Kansas, its spine now thoroughly broken and repaired twice with careful stitching, and Gideon sat across from her with the day's last coffee and the sound of the night coming in through the open window, and she looked up from the book. "I've been thinking," she said. "What about?" "About what you said at the river yesterday. That you don't miss it for 1 minute." "That's the truth," he said. "I know it is," she said. "That's what I was thinking about, how certain you were." She paused. "I was thinking about April of 1878. I was thinking about what it would have been if I hadn't looked back." He considered this. "I didn't say anything at the crossing," he said. "You know that." "I know," she said. "I said it for both of us." 2 words, he said. "They were the right 2 words," she said. He thought about April of 1878, the cold water and the screaming horses, and the woman who had looked at him without flinching and said thank you like she meant it. And he thought about the weeks after that, the haunted weeks, the weeks of thinking about something he didn't have a name for and didn't dare pursue, and the extraordinary series of accidents and decisions and half-reasonable impulses that had eventually brought him to a parlor on Hickory Street in Caldwell with 3 sleeping children upstairs and this woman with the brown eyes across the lamp from him. "Olive," he said. She looked at him. "Thank you," he said. Exactly those words. Exactly that simplicity. The same 2 words, returned to their origin, given back to her. She understood him immediately, as she always did, because she was Olive Turner and she had always known exactly what she was saying and exactly what he meant, and she held his gaze for a long moment with those direct, brown, impossibly honest eyes. "You're welcome," she said. And then, because she was also the woman who had waded into the Cimarron in her traveling clothes and stood in the current without panic, she smiled. "Thank you back." He laughed. It was a full, real laugh, the kind that had once been trained out of him, and that 12 years of this life had trained back in again. A slow, patient restoration, one reason at a time. She laughed too, softly, mindful of the sleeping children, and the parlor was warm with the lamp light, and the window was open to the Kansas night. And the world outside was the same world it had always been, indifferent and vast and full of rivers that rose without warning and crossings that required someone willing to walk into the water and hold on. But in here, in this room, in this house, in this town that had become home in the way that places become home when you've woven your life into them thread by thread over years of actual living, everything was exactly right. Not perfect, not without difficulty or impermanence or the ordinary grief of loving people in a world that does not guarantee them to you. But right in the deep structural sense, in the way that a well-built shelf is right, in the way that a clean river running over a gravel bar is right, in the way that 2 people who looked at each other without flinching and said the truest things they knew and then built a life on the saying of them were exactly, completely, finally and permanently right. The lamp burned. The night moved. Somewhere upstairs Oliver murmured something in his sleep and went quiet again. Errol's light had long since gone out. June's too, though Olive suspected June was still awake, being curious about the dark in the way she was curious about everything. Gideon set down his coffee cup and Olive set down her book, and they sat together in the good quiet of a life that had been built by 2 people who had each, in their own way, decided that what was worth having was worth walking through the current for, and who had not once stopped walking. The stars came out over Caldwell, over the cottonwood trees and the school on Hickory Street and the hardware store that Thomas Greer had rebuilt, and the church on Oak Street and the survey office with its careful records and the house where they lived. And the night settled in all the way to its edges. And the river, 40 miles south, kept running, as rivers do, indifferent and beautiful and always moving forward.